After a tumultuous year in Canadian politics, two federal parties begin 2026 facing leadership issues. At the end of January, Conservative Party members will vote on whether Pierre Poilievre should stay on as leader, as recent defections of Conservative MPs to Mark Carney's Liberals raise doubts for some. The New Democrats will choose their new leader in March to replace Jagmeet Singh. Activist Avi Lewis and Alberta NDP MP Heather McPherson rank as the frontrunners in a party with sharply reduced presence in Parliament. For Carney's government, the focus in the coming year remains the ongoing trade dispute with the U.S. and the review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. The three nations will all come together this summer to co-host the biggest sporting event in the world, as the effects of Trump's ongoing tariffs still punish Canadian industries such as steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, and automobiles. Carney will continue to try to get a handle on affordability, with housing and grocery prices continuing to rise despite a slowing of the overall inflation rate.
Most people think Canada's biggest political decisions are still ahead, waiting somewhere in 2026. But what if that assumption is already wrong? What if the real turning point didn't arrive with an election date or a policy announcement, but quietly began the moment certain words were spoken and others were carefully left unsaid? When Mark Carney recently stepped forward to speak, it looked ordinary on the surface. Calm tone, measured language, familiar themes. To many viewers, it felt like just another political appearance. But in moments like these, the most important signals are rarely obvious. They hide in timing, in restraint, and in the subtle shift between what leaders used to say and what they no longer feel comfortable repeating. This wasn't just a speech. It was a signal. Not because of a dramatic promise or a bold declaration, but because it reflected a growing reality that Canada can no longer delay certain choices without consequences. The country is moving into a period where hesitation itself becomes a decision, and where every attempt to buy time quietly narrows the options available later. That is the pressure Mark Carney is now standing inside. For years, Canada benefited from a relatively predictable global environment. Trade rules were stable, alliances were dependable, economic shocks were treated as temporary disruptions rather than permanent shifts. That world is fading fast. The new environment is harsher, faster, and far less forgiving. And it is demanding clarity from leaders who built their reputations on caution and balance. Carney's background suggests discipline, experience, and an ability to manage crises. But this moment is different from managing interest rates or stabilizing institutions. This is not a technical problem. It is a political and strategic one, where every path forward carries risk, and neutrality itself can become costly. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that the pressure is coming from multiple directions at once. Internationally, Canada faces a world where economic nationalism is no longer a fringe idea. Major partners are reshoring industries, rewriting trade priorities, and demanding loyalty that often conflicts with long-standing agreements. The old assumption that Canada could quietly benefit from stability elsewhere is breaking down. At home, voters are no longer responding to abstract reassurance. Rising costs, job insecurity, and global instability have compressed public patience. People want to know not just what leaders believe, but what they are willing to risk. Silence, or overly careful language, is now interpreted as uncertainty rather than wisdom. This is where Mark Carney's position becomes uniquely complicated. Every major decision in front of him now carries a legacy cost. Move too cautiously, and Canada risks drifting into irrelevance, reacting to global shifts instead of shaping its own future. Move too aggressively, and the country could absorb shocks that its economy and political system are not fully prepared to handle. The space between those two outcomes is shrinking, and that is why this moment matters more than the speech itself. Carney is not being tested on knowledge or experience. He is being tested on judgment under pressure, when no option is clean and no delay is neutral. History shows that this is where even highly capable leaders struggle. Not because they lack intelligence, but because the environment punishes hesitation more harshly than mistakes. What makes this especially significant is how quietly this transition is happening. There is no single headline announcing that Canada has entered a decisive phase. No dramatic emergency vote. No official declaration of a turning point. Yet the conditions are already in place. Global markets are adjusting. Political expectations are hardening. And allies are watching not what Canada says, but how long it takes to say it. That silence creates its own story. Some will argue that this caution is intentional, that Carney is waiting for the right moment, the right alignment of circumstances. And that may be true, but waiting has a cost that grows over time. In fast-moving environments, clarity itself becomes a form of leadership, even when it carries risk. This is where the future splits into two very different paths. In one scenario, Carney manages to convert this pressure into authority. He uses the uncertainty to define a clear direction, absorbs the initial backlash, and positions Canada as a country willing to adapt rather than drift. That path is uncomfortable in the short term, but it offers long-term stability and relevance. In the other scenario, the pressure continues to build while decisions remain incremental. Each delay appears reasonable on its own, but together they form a pattern of hesitation. By the time clarity arrives, the strategic window may already be closing, forcing Canada to react rather than lead. Neither outcome is guaranteed, and that uncertainty is precisely why this moment deserves attention. What is often overlooked is that leadership tests rarely announce themselves clearly. They appear disguised as routine events, ordinary speeches, and familiar language. The real test is not what is said publicly, but how leaders internalize the constraints tightening around them. Carney now stands at that intersection. The question is no longer whether Canada will face major decisions by 2026. That much is obvious. The deeper question is whether the defining choices are already underway, shaped by moments like this, where restraint and timing carry more weight than bold declarations. If that is true, then the next phase of Canada's political story will not begin with a dramatic announcement. It will be written through accumulation, small signals, careful wording, delayed commitments, and the growing awareness that the margin for error is narrowing. This is why this moment matters. Not because it offers clear answers, but because it exposes the tension beneath the surface. A tension between experience and adaptation. Between caution and clarity. Between waiting for the future and realizing that the future may already be arriving. Whether Mark Carney ultimately passes this test is still an open question. What is clear is that the test itself has begun, quietly, without ceremony, and without the luxury of certainty. And in times like these, the most dangerous assumption a country can make is believing that the hardest decisions are still safely ahead.